everyone. President Grimson, distinguished delegates, it's great to be here with all of you. I'm sure your head is just buzzing with the extraordinary potential of technologies like the ones that Robbie just demonstrated. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm a resilience researcher. I study resilience in social and ecological and systemic resilience. And I'm happy to be working very closely now with Planet Labs and with Robbie and the team on how to take the extraordinary assets that Planet Labs is producing and put them in the hands of the people who are on the very front lines of making the most important forms of social, environmental, humanitarian change in the world. Now, today, what I'd like to do just in a few minutes is just take these ideas about sensing the world around us and put them into a framework, elevate them into a framework around issues of systemic and social resilience. But before I do that, I thought we could do a little exercise together, specifically one on noticing change. And what I'd like to do, with your permission today, is I'm going to show you two images on the screen. We're going to do a little game together, okay? The two images on the screen, I promise you there's only two, and they're going to blink on the screen like this. Got that? It took me a long time to practice how to make that sound. And there's one and only one difference between the two images. And what I'd like you to do is when you see the difference between these two images, I'd like you to gently raise your hand. Not so you block the person behind you. This is not a competition. I just want to count you, okay? When you see the change, just gently raise your hand so I can count you. Everyone got that? Ready? Okay, let's go. Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, that's good. I just wanted to get about 3% of the people in the room to see it. So just out of curiosity, how many people here saw no difference between those two images? Please raise your hands. I'd like you to meet the honest cohort here at the Arctic Circle. I don't know what those other people were looking at, but never mess with a person with a clicker. For those of you who didn't see a difference between those two images, and by the way, the first time I saw this, I didn't see the difference between the two images. I'd like you to pay attention to this part of the image right here. And I'd like you to watch as the thing that holds airplanes in the sky disappeared in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again, about 40 or 50 times, and about 90% of the people in the room, 95% of the people in the room didn't see it at all, and only about 3 to 5% of you saw it after about 25 or 30 seconds of looking. So why? Why is that the case? Why did we miss it? So how many people here started by looking at the soldiers? Raise your hands. By the way, that makes you exactly like all other human beings on Earth, so welcome to the human race. I just want you all to know, everybody looks at the soldiers first. How many people after the soldiers looked at the tail of the airplane? Some people looked at the tail of the airplane first. Now that makes you exactly like the rest of humanity. Now, the reason we do that is because human beings are exquisitely sensitive. Our brains are designed through lots and lots of evolution and trial and error. We've developed extraordinary capacities to pay attention to the things that we think subconsciously are going to matter. And overwhelmingly, those are the things that are bound up in other people. We pay attention to what tribe people are. And we pay attention to the things that we think are going to change, the things that change every day. The things that happen in the background, the backgrounded forms of change, are much harder for human beings to pay attention to. And the reason I wanted to show you this today, in fact, you'll see in a moment, but a wonderful thinker about the future, a guy named Stuart Brand, once famously said about these kinds of changes, that in our societies, the fast-moving trends are the ones that get most of the attention, but it's actually the slow-moving trends, the stuff that's happening in the background, that's harder for us to see, that have most of the power. As you could see there, Because if you got on that airplane without an aircraft engine, that's the first thing you should check, by the way, the next time you're on a jetway. Just peek out the window and make sure they're still on the aircraft. We're living in a time in which extraordinary amounts of change are happening, but they're happening at a spatial resolution and at a temporal resolution that's difficult for human beings to comprehend. We're not designed to see change in these capacities. We're living in a time generally of spikes, of movement, of trends associated with the human footprint from a period when things were moving broadly horizontally to broadly vertically. And this is a chart that comes from a wonderful institute called the Stockholm Resilience Center, an epicenter of research on these factors. So one of the most important things about the technologies that you're hearing about here is that they begin to take those changes that exist outside of the normal envelope of human sensing and put them into context for us. Because context is the first and most essential step to creating lasting change. The world we live in now, a world in which everything is going vertical, the number of people on Earth, the amount of water usage, ozone depletion, ocean ecosystem use, coastal zone infrastructures, the number of McDonald's restaurants has gone absolutely vertical. Terrifying to some and delighting to others, depending on your point of view. What's interesting about this is that all of these forms of verticality are connected to each other. We live in the world some have called the age of the giant hairball, giant over-connected, over-coupled systems. And when you take a world of over-coupling in which we create change in one system and we deeply connect it to changes in another system, you create complexity. And over-coupling and complexity and naturally exceeding our planetary limits leads us to an environment of inevitable surprise and creates maybe the most important question of this century. And that's this one. How, while we move hopefully ever toward a more sustainable future, do we help people and systems recover, persist, or even thrive amid disruption? Because we're going to be living with much more disruption than we have ever had before. So in order to do that, what we're beginning to see is a shift towards some new languages, some new ways of thinking about making systems, and some new ways of thinking about bolstering the natural resilient capacity of human beings. On the systems side, you're starting to see this new language of modularity and diversity, efficiency, redundancy, transparency, loose coupling so that systems can gracefully fail. If one part fails, the whole system doesn't come down. And systems that learn and adapt over time. These are the kinds of systems we're going to need to build. And one central idea about the Arctic that you've heard over and over again this morning, and I'm sure we'll hear for the next few days, is that the Arctic, because it is an epicenter of change, is also a crucible, a laboratory for understanding how to build systems that work like this. On the human side, we have to think about new ways of bolstering people's trust, their cooperation, their creativity, their voice, their agency at the local level, their sense of social coherence, compassion, and solidarity with each other and with the planet. Pulling these two design agendas together is really what most of us are here to do in one way or another. But I want you to pay attention in particular to this idea of modularity, diversity, efficiency, and redundancy, because I want to tell you about one specific form of redundancy and one very resilient organization, and that is Planet Labs. And just because this just happened a couple of days ago, some of you might know that that in Virginia recently, an orbital science rocket just took off and exploded. Boom, like that. It was carrying 26 satellite doves. You are watching them. There's probably 26 streaks there. I was on an airplane when this happened, and through the gifts of great aerial Wi-Fi, I was able to instantly talk to the team, because, my goodness, this could be life-ending. What's going on? What's happened, right? I've got these news alerts coming up that something terrible has happened. And I talked to the team, and it was amazing to see that everybody was like, yeah, okay, space is hard. Space is hard. That was the message from Robbie, the CEO, Will, and the whole team. But we're keeping going. We're working on the next batch of satellites already. Because one of the ways in which building systems that are small, redundant, agile, inexpensive, where the systems they replace are big, bureaucratic, and structural, is that when you encounter inevitable failures, if you are agile and redundant, you can keep on trucking. And that's an example of the kinds of resilience that I think we're going to see more of. I'm going to end my remarks just with one little mental model for how to think about resilience at a systems level. A lot of people, this term has come up a great deal. There are extraordinary organizations, most recently the Rockefeller Foundation, USAID, the Swedish government, soon to be the World Bank, I think, and others have come together to form a new global resilience partnership that's looking at vulnerable places in the world and how to bolster their systemic and social resilience. You hear this term bandied around a lot, and in fact, Planet Labs will, I think, will be a significant collaborator in those efforts. But then the question that comes up, how do you put them into practice? What are the verbs? What does it mean to do this stuff? And so I thought I'd just share with you one mental model that's been helpful for bringing people together over these conversations. It breaks the idea of resilience into 4 basic clusters of activities. And the first one is about building regenerative capacity, the kinds of slow building of health. In a society, it's often measured by creativity and trust and social coherence. In a food system, it's measured by the capacity of the system to provide for the people who depend upon it. This happens to be a measure of the photosynthetic capacity of, in this case, North America, as recently measured from space. And this is a slow form of capacity building. Capacity building doesn't happen instantaneously. It's the slow process of making a system healthy and keeping it healthy. Then there's a second cluster of activities, and those are about sensing emerging risks. Essentially, how do we instrument a system to listen for change? Now, not every form of change can be anticipated, but the very act of listening itself is its own form of capacity building, and that is why, especially, these kinds of technologies are so important, because they allow us to listen in such a fundamentally new way. The third capacity is about how we respond to disruptions when they occur. And one of the most powerful things about this kind of data is what happens not just before a disruption occurs, but how we can put it into the hands of people who are directly affected, not just governments and institutions and companies, but also citizens. Because citizens represent a tremendous form of capacity in their own right in response. And then finally, there's the long process of learning and transforming, deciding when a system has shown itself to be vulnerable, when do we decide to bolster its capacity, and when do we decide to abandon it and transform our dependence upon it because we can no longer rely on it. That's ultimately a political question, but here's the important thing. When you look at these 4 different clusters of activities that are all connected with feedback loops and feedbackward loops, some of them slow, some of them quick, all of this data, all of this information is going to inform each of these activities. It's not just about responding more quickly, it's about anticipating what comes next and learning how to think differently about the kinds of futures. We can only do that if we have the right kinds of information to begin to think about. And that is incredibly exciting. And that's why these efforts in particular, I think, are going to lead us to a much more resilient future. Thank you very much.